Hi guys, welcome back to part 2 of creating an anime environment in Blender. So today we're going to be continuing the blockout process that we did in part 1 of the series. So we've already blocked out our basic shapes. We have our focal point, we know where our road is, we have all our buildings blocked out, and we know where this is going. So for this environment, I have already created some pre-made houses that fit the theme. So you can see here on the left, I have these medieval homes. They're already modeled. I've done the modeling. The texturing isn't done at this point yet, but as you guys have seen in the beginning, I have finished it. So what I'm doing is I'm dragging these homes in. They're completely finished, and I'm just dragging them to where these blocked out houses are, which are just those cubes and cylinders and the shapes that we have that are showing us where we want our, a focal point to be and where each building is going to go. So you do not have to pre-make all of these homes like I did. In this situation, I had already started creating a scene. I was replicating an image that I had found, and once the creator, the original 2D artist of that picture, reached out to me, he had mentioned that it was copyrighted and I could not use it. So I, had to scratch the idea of using that, but I still used those houses that I made. I made those houses, I tweaked the textures, I tweaked the geometry a bit, and now they're original and unique. So I'm using those for this, and I'm also using some pre-made houses from another scene I made, which is like a mountain city I made, very medieval style. So I'm using those same assets here and cleaning them up. So like you can see here, this house only has a front. It doesn't have a side or a back. So going forward, off camera, I end up cleaning up the geometry, making sure that the sides of these houses are good, the roofs, everything is the way I want. But basically what happens in this stage is one of two things. Either you're like me and you have assets pre-made, or you're going to be creating your assets based off of your blockout. Either or is fine. So a lot of the times I end up just modeling the mesh from start from my blockout. And in the next video that I'll be posting, I'll be going over how I do the geometry and the modeling process of one of these homes that I am using in one of these scenes. So you can see here, I'm just dragging things in, and this is the process where you're bringing in finished models or you're modeling them and you're starting to get a feel for what your scene looks like. I'm not changing the dynamic or the shape or even the focal point of my scene anymore. That was what I was doing in the part 1. I was making sure that I had, our animation path, our visuals, and everything like that. And now I'm taking in my final assets and I'm putting them in the exact same spots we had those cubes. And then I'm adding some extra details. Like I have some pre-made chimneys, some little crow's nest towers, I don't know what you would call those, but I have different medieval assets that I'm able to bring into the scene, populate it, and really quickly get a feel for this. So this took me about 40 to 50 minutes to populate the scene, and that's because I had the assets pre-made. If you are making everything from scratch, this will take a lot longer, especially if you're doing every house individually and you're making each one unique. Some of these I end up tweaking. So coming up next, very soon, I do the bridge. The bridge is something I ended up having to tweak a couple of times because it was a different feel that I wanted to create than the asset that I had already made. Right here, I wanted to bring in a curve, and I'm gonna parent the camera to it to follow a long path. I do this because I want to see how this flows, because I have the idea of the animation path. So the camera is gonna go up towards this castle, and we're gonna get this nice medieval relaxing vibe. Maybe like a carriage, like a horse carriage, is pulling them. That's what I end up using for the audio in the future. But I set this up so that I know what these houses are looking like. Maybe some of them have to be closer, or some of them have to be spread out, rotated a little bit more. But the point of bringing the camera is because I know exactly how I want this environment to feel. I have a vision, I have references that I'm working with. So bringing in this camera helps me really make sure that the end product looks like that. So I set up the camera, I get this animation path going, and this will be a very key reference that I use. Also, I use some very interesting camera settings, as you can see here. I don't always use the 1920 by 1080. A lot of times I use some weird camera dimensions and also some focal lengths. Your focal lengths can be used to distort and to see more of your scene or to see less, but you can actually distort geometry based on your focal length. I usually go with like 20 to 24 millimeter, at least what I find to be like the sweet spot for environments, especially because I don't have a character as the focal point. If you do have a character that is your focal point that you're going to be focusing on, you're probably going to be using a much higher millimeter, maybe 35, 50, or even higher, because you're going to be zoomed into the camera, into the character, my bad. So, but this whole process for environments is really simple, especially if you have these assets, because you're just pulling them in, scaling them, rotating. It's not complicated. If you are doing each individual house from scratch, like you're doing the geometry right after the modeling process, it will take a long time, so you have to be patient and don't lose sight of the picture that you're going for. And don't get discouraged, because sometimes it can be very discouraging. You know, you see my videos, how fast, how quickly an environment comes together. This is not the case for most 3D artists, especially when you're starting off. I've been doing this for a year. I've made a lot of environments so far that have a lot of diversity, uniqueness in the buildings. So I don't have to model as much as somebody else will. So when I'm making this environment took me 3 or 4 days, which is not typical. Typically they take maybe a week and a half to 2 weeks, sometimes even longer, depending on how detailed I go. So this environment was a very quick one that I was able to do, and that's why I'm doing this tutorial series. I wanted to show you guys how I do this. The blocking out process is in 2 parts. Start off with cubes, just basic shapes. The second one is I bring in these final homes. You might be modeling from scratch, you might be doing what I'm doing. After this, I'm doing some videos on the actual modeling, texturing, compositing, freestyle, render settings, and shading, because those are all very important parts for the style that I create in Blender. It's a unique style, this anime style, and geometry can be a very important part. So, like you can see here, the geometry, you can get the feel for what the environment's going to look like, but I mark all of these geometry edges, the freestyle edges, so that I can mark out, so I can get the right freestyle lines that I want. So when I'm making these environments, oftentimes I will be doing some test renders where it's all white textures and then just freestyle lines. But in this case, I mostly work in the matcap because I can get a really good visual of the geometry and what it looks like. So this is the bridge I was talking to you guys about earlier. It has 2 like loopholes, paths, and I stretch it out. That's how I want it to look. But there's a second one to the right that obviously I don't want it there. So I did the modeling and the fixing off screen, and really all it was is I deleted the lower half and remodeled it so that it was just 1 archway instead of 2. And then it's done. It's nothing complicated. But a lot of these buildings I did where they're only modeled from one point of view, so I did do a lot of fixing up where I had to model the sides because they didn't have the wood or the shiplap or any windows or any extra details. It's just a blank wall, which isn't realistic. So, and especially with this scene where it's very dynamic, the camera's moving, you have an animation. I wanted to make sure that I did that so that when we're going, there's not these like blank walls that just look empty. But this is a super simple process, especially if you did a good job blocking out. If your blockout was clean and you had everything the way you wanted, you had your structure, you had your path, your visual focal points, you know, where you want the viewer to, their eyes to be focused to, then this process is super easy because you're not moving anything around. You're just bringing in assets or modeling them, which is, for me, my favorite part. Modeling is my favorite part by far because you see the biggest change. From the beginning of this video to now, we have basically an animation. This is looking more full, it's detailed, it has a lot going for it, which is crazy considering like this only took me an hour or so to do from the blockout stage. And you guys can do this too, especially if you have assets. The big thing for this style is the flat colors. So this isn't much different than what you would do for like maybe a photoreal or like game assets, geometry wise. But what really makes the difference is the freestyle lines and the flat textures. Emission shaders are golden for this style. When you're trying to make anime styled environments in Blender, it is so hard to get the right feeling when you use diffuse or principled BSDF because they use realistic lighting, and anime doesn't use realistic lighting. Very little realistic lighting. It's very sharp color changes, very little gradients, and when there is, it's not correct to real life. It's just a visually appealing aspect of it. So this part is, it's a big part of it, but the most important part is the shading and the shadows, the coloring. That's what really draws everything in. So you can see here what I just brought in, the castle, the road, this stuff I did off camera because you guys don't really need to see it, because I'm going to be doing the other tutorials on how I model a house, how do I texture the house, how do I freestyle the house, and so forth. But you get the idea of, if you have the assets, you can pull them in once you have an idea. And here, basically, if you were to do a larger scene here or create a game environment, this is the possibility. You can continue from where you have. So when you come to like animations or cinematic renders or just stills, you don't have to create the full picture. You're just creating, like you can see here, I have like the background, the foreground, and then there's a huge gap of emptiness in between. So when you're creating a game, or if you want to have a really large animation that works in this area a lot and you want to create the whole thing, this is kind of the process that I'm going. Same thing as when I did the block out. I take my annotation tool, block out things like houses, roads. You can see I marked out like a lake, a harbor, a lot of houses. And this would take a lot longer to finish because you're not just creating a small environment for a 30-second animation. You're now creating practically a world or a map, which takes a lot more time, especially if you start getting into trees and mountains and more foliage, grass. Those things, for me in this style, they're very intensive. They're hard to make correctly. The texturing is more complicated. The shapes, it's just a hard thing to accomplish because anime does a very interesting style of high detail and very, very low detail style, like grass and trees and stuff like that. So you have a very large variation based on distance. But you guys get the idea. Blocking out is one of the biggest and the most important parts of my environment creations. Without a good block out, without a good mark out with annotation tool, I don't have a sense of direction with my art. It's just, it can get lost very, very quickly. So I always start with this. I always start with annotation, blocking out, and then I start my modeling process or dragging in assets before I get into foliage and texturing and freestyle and yada yada yada. You can get very far out with everything else. So, I just wanted to let you guys know there's a lot that goes on with these, but a good block out is what makes the difference between a good and a bad environment. So I want you guys to prioritize that, and I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I'll see you guys for part 3.